This program is brought to you by PLI, the Practicing Law Institute. To learn more about this podcast, visit pli.edu/pro bono podcast.
ProJourn has been transformative for us. Most of our work would not be possible without them, however stubborn I may be.
There was no desire from the city's part to be collaborative at the beginning, which I think is why the suit ended up being as big and dramatic as it was.
Welcome to part 2 of our discussion about ProJourn, the pro bono program dedicated to getting journalists vital legal help so they can get the facts and get their stories out to the public. In this episode, we'll focus in on one news organization and the lawyers that have been helping them since 2021. Welcome to Pursuing Justice, the Pro Bono Files, a podcast from PLI, the Practicing Law Institute. We are here to tell pro bono stories that we hope inspire you to take your own pro bono legal work to the next level. I'm your host, Alicia Aiken. I've worked in civil rights, criminal defense, and civil legal aid, but now I'm a principal at the Danu Center for Strategic Advocacy and a faculty fellow at PLI. And I love getting to talk with volunteer lawyers and nonprofit legal projects around the country about the pro bono work that matters to them. I hope you enjoy these conversations as much as I do. Let's meet our guests, starting with Jeffrey King.
I'm Jeffrey King, a Jeff to my friends, including y'all. I am the founder and editor of Open Vallejo, which is the only nonprofit investigative newsroom here in my hometown of Vallejo, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area. I am also the founder and CEO of Informed California Foundation, which is the parent nonprofit of Open Vallejo, which seeks to take the lessons from Vallejo, given the unique circumstances here, and treat it not only as an investigative newsroom, but as a design lab for pro-journalism, pro-transparency, pro-democracy interventions to help facilitate transparency throughout the state.
And we have 2 of the ProJourn pro bono lawyers who have worked with Open Vallejo, including Seema Sarafan, who we met in part 1 of the episode.
I'm Seema Sarafan. I'm an assistant general counsel at Microsoft. I, along with Tom Burke, co-founded ProJourn in January 2020. My connection with Open Vallejo came shortly after that as we, with Tom Burke's outreach, worked with Jeff King on pre-publication review matters and a litigation matter that was filed with Tom and Sarah.
And Sarah Burns of Davis Wright Tremaine, who is a pro bono trial lawyer for Open Vallejo.
My name is Sarah Burns. I am an associate in the San Francisco office of Davis Wright Tremaine. I practice media law. I have been representing Open Vallejo in its California Public Records Act lawsuit against the city of Vallejo, basically since it started in 2021, and also doing a little bit of pre-publication review for Open Vallejo.
So let's start with Open Vallejo. Jeff, tell us about the news organization that you've founded.
Open Vallejo is a small nonprofit investigative newsroom here in my hometown of Vallejo, which, to the best of my knowledge, has never in its history really had a great deal of investigative reporting. I founded it in February of 2019. I was spending more time here when my mom was sick and was reminded of how amazing this community is and started to see some of the issues with the city government and in particular the police department. Prior to Open Vallejo, I was a First Amendment litigator and then transitioned into teaching at the college and law school levels, and was also during that time working primarily in press freedom advocacy, non-litigation press freedom advocacy. So I was well primed to, I think, enter this particular space where It was unlike anything I had seen inside the United States in terms of journalists and civil rights lawyers being threatened, residents being threatened and retaliated against for speaking up on matters of public concern. And I will say it has been, with the greatest respect for attorneys, and particularly pro bono and public interest attorneys, it's been the most impactful thing I've ever done, partly because we are producing, I believe, in-depth, broad scope investigations that you would normally see at the national level in terms of the resources that we put into them, but at a very small scale. It's that local legitimacy and that local knowledge and familiarity and being in community that I think is really critical.
How big is Vallejo?
125,000 people.
Okay.
And for 20 years, our research shows the police, the force about 100 officers, were shooting somebody on average once every 4 months. They have not killed anybody since 2020, which is when we launched, and also obviously when George Floyd was murdered and the California Department of Justice came in. But they have not killed anybody. Most of the people that they shot over those 20 years died.
What were you seeing in Vallejo, your hometown, that drove you to think, I need to make this career switch and I need to start this investigative journalism and open records project, specifically to focus on Vallejo?
So Vallejo is my hometown, which is why I, was so aghast and so focused on it. I also think that Vallejo is representative of similar issues, perhaps not to the same degree in every place, but I think that a lot of these issues come up in other places. The very first thing that happened, if you'll indulge me, is I joined Nextdoor, and there's a very thoughtful neighbor who, after a couple incidents with a specific officer went viral, he asked, well, what's the city going to do about this guy? And how much is this stuff costing the city in civil rights settlements? And I mean, this was a response to somebody else's post on Nextdoor. So I thought, well, I don't know the answer to the disciplinary question, but I bet I could spitball the civil rights question. And so I did. I spent a Sunday afternoon looking into it and finding available public records that were already publicly online. And the numbers were astronomical. And so I just responded on Nextdoor and I footnoted what I'd written.
Eventually, reporting by Open Vallejo would reveal that the city of Vallejo, California, paid out over $15 million in civil rights violations in nearly 20 lawsuits between 2010 and 2020. Again, Vallejo is a city of about 125,000 people in the Bay Area. And the city did not appreciate Jeff's early attempts to put a number on the civil rights payouts in his Nextdoor post.
Well, a few days later, I received an email from the city attorney, not a city attorney, asking me what my sources were for this analysis. Now, keep in mind, I had footnoted the entire thing and linked and all that. And I was going to respond, and I remember I got a nail in my tire. And so I was late getting home, and by the time I woke up the next morning, I believe, I had a very long email from the same city attorney, copying the police chief, copying the city manager, copying the entire city council and much of their staff. And it was a purported teardown of my quote unquote article, which again was a comment on Nextdoor. But and some of the arguments I thought were strange. And I was really taken aback. I mean, it threw up really big red flags. I'd never seen anything like this. And here I was just kind of in good faith trying to answer a factual question. And so a couple days later, decided to go to the first town hall of a council member elect. And I waited respectfully for my neighbors to, ask their concerns. And, this is a crowd that looks like the community I grew up in. It looks like the Bay Area I remember. And so I waited and want to be respectful of people who were there. And then, eventually put my hand up and asked a pretty innocuous question about the settlements because it had caused such a kerfuffle. And this council member looked like he wanted to punch me in the face. just a total cloud came over him. And so that night we went to dinner with a friend of mine from law school who had also come back to his hometown, who was a prosecutor, violent felonies mostly. And I was just like, what is going on with this place? I mean, you work in local government. Like, do you know anything? We're kind of all at a loss. And then that night is when those 6 Vallejo police officers semicircled around Willie McCoy's car, shone 600 lumen tactical flashlights in his face until he stirred in his sleep, said, I don't even want to give him a chance. If he reaches, he allegedly had a gun in his lap. If he reaches for it, you know what to do. And then when he scratched his left shoulder with his right hand, seemingly still asleep, they screamed at him for 3 seconds and fired him for 3.5. And at that point, I mean, that's when Open Vallejo started.
Willie McCoy was a 20-year-old Black musician who fell asleep in his car at a Taco Bell. Body camera video showed that the Vallejo police opened fire on him before he even completely woke up, shooting him 55 times. This event was galvanizing for Jeff because it wasn't even particularly unique in Vallejo. In fact, one of those officers at the Taco Bell had killed Ronell Foster the year before. Foster was a 33-year-old unarmed Black man who the officer tried to stop for riding his bike erratically and without a light. When Foster ran from the officer shot him in the back of the head.
Did a little more research that night, realized the city had lost its insurance provider of 31 years pretty recently because of the civil rights settlements, published it on Medium, and we were off to the races. It was an experiment. I was doing it on Twitter and Facebook. The name Open Vallejo came to me as I filed that first Public Records Act request, just because I had heard murmurs of people being retaliated against. So I said, well, why don't I just use something other than my name? And I thought of it in the instant. It stuck. But because of just doing that work with literally just a laptop and an internet connection and a couple social media accounts and created a logo, people started reaching out.
So you filed an open records request. You are yourself an experienced First Amendment attorney, an experienced media journalism protection attorney. What kind of legal help did you feel like you needed to pursue your mission at Open Vallejo?
So I didn't want to have a fool for a client. I realized that being in the mix, being on the ground, you need people to advise you, people who are not as close to the situation. I mean, it was scary at times. I was getting very specific threats for a while. I know this stuff, decently in theory, but one is just a matter of competence. Can I do a good job of representing the organization while also serving as, an editor and a writer? And, also, who on earth would turn down some of the best First Amendment lawyers in the entire country? I mean, I remember when I had the initial conversation with Tom Burke, when I think ProJourn was still being formed, I remember he offered to be our pro bono newsroom counsel. And I was thinking, this guy's living infrastructure. This is like getting a donated building or something, and same with SEMA. And now we have a whole team. And so, it would be silly to turn that down, but also it's amazing to have such intelligent, thoughtful, professional, powerful people in our corner. I feel I'm no longer concerned about physical safety, but I nonetheless feel safer in other ways for having, this team backing us up. And, there's things I don't think of. We've, I think, done a pretty good job of internalizing our conversations, with legal counsel, and we don't have to lean on them quite as heavily. But anytime we have anything investigative, particularly our big investigations, that is a searching inquiry. I can tell you that the folks on this team they leave no stone unturned, and that's exactly what we want. We want to, not only kick the tires, but start dismantling things and looking inside and really tearing down any possible sources of weakness of our articles. And I will tell you that anecdotally, but frequently, we hear from even the subjects of some of our very critical reporting. I was speaking with somebody the other day who has a pretty public reputation for some really violent incidents. And he kind of started seeing me around. I'm also a photojournalist, so I'm out there at scenes. And I spoke with him and he said, look, I know you guys are going to be fair and you've never gotten anything wrong, even a small detail about the incidents in which I've been involved. And I just think that there's, at least grudging respect for the care and caution that we put into the work. But nonetheless, I think would be a lot harder if we didn't have our own internal professional skeptics.
That's a good way of putting it. Your own internal professional skeptics helping make sure that you're getting the facts right. And to have someone who's been a subject of your reporting acknowledge, whether I like the implication or agree with your implication, your facts are accurate.
And fairly presented. And we've heard this from a number of people at this point, which I was not anticipating being able to tell you that or being told that ever. And that's just how it's been.
Well, let's get to know your team. Now that you've said all these glowing things about them, we have with us today Sarah Burns. So Sarah, before we talk about your work with Open Vallejo, tell me about your regular practice, your non-pro bono practice at Davis Wright Tremaine.
Yeah, so I am in the firm's media group. I am a media and First Amendment lawyer. I represent journalists and activists mostly when they are sued for defamation. I also represent them when they are subpoenaed to either produce news gathering materials or testify. I also do pre-publication review for journalists and also for television shows, documentaries, and animated shows, and a whole range of things. And then I do a lot of public records. So I do both the California Public Records Act, which is the statute that we sued under for Open Vallejo, and then I also do a good amount of FOIA work, which is the federal statute. And so basically all of my work is media work.
How did you get into this practice of law?
So I am kind of the inverse of Jeff, which is that I was a journalist briefly, and then I went to law school. And so I always wanted to do this kind of work. In law school, I was in the First Amendment amicus clinic that Eugene Volokh runs at UCLA. And I took a bunch of First Amendment classes and I wrote a bunch of moot court problems about First Amendment problems. And it was basically what I always wanted to do. But it's very hard to get a job in this space because a lot of people want to do it. And so immediately after law school, I did commercial litigation. And then I was contacted by a recruiter who was like, you have the right background for this job. It was a job I didn't even know existed. So basically my dream job fell into my lap, which is an extreme privilege. So that's how I came into it.
Yes, although luck favors the prepared, right? You had done the journalism work. You had clearly done the work in law school. You had done the clinic work. So I do understand what you're saying when you have somebody recognize all the preparation you're done. Plenty of people don't get that privilege, but you certainly earned it. And so when you describe your main core paid work and what I'm hearing already about the pro bono work that you're doing with Open Vallejo and ProJourn, they sound pretty similar. So how does the pro bono part fit in with the, pays the bills part?
Yeah, I mean, they are really similar. I think, in general, we don't do defamation work pro bono. I think public records is really the place that there is both pro bono and paid work. And I think also there aren't that many litigations that one files outside of like kind of the impact litigation space where you feel like maybe what you're doing is like a public good. And I think what we are doing with Open Vallejo and with the other kind of Public Records Act pro bono cases is certainly a public good. I feel very, very lucky to do it.
And I know that Davis Wright has a team of lawyers working with Open Vallejo and that you're one of them and you're with us today, but who else is on the team so we make sure they get credit?
Yeah, so it's primarily me and Tom Burke. Tom Burke, who Jeff mentioned, is an institution in the Public Records Act space. He also literally wrote the book on the anti-SLAPP statute in California. So it's the two of us, and then we've had some help from Megan Maris, who is another associate in the San Francisco office.
I would just also add, we can mention him, Sarah, Bruce Johnson who has passed away now, but he reviewed at least 2, if not 3 matters, pre-publication matters with me for Open Vallejo. I mention him because he's probably, along with Tom, was one of the most well-regarded First Amendment lawyers, not just at Davis Wright, but nationally.
I'd actually like to add on to that very briefly, just to say that our attorneys have been incredibly responsive. And part of the reason I think Bruce came on to work on that was it was a pretty quick turnaround article, one of them that was really significant, and we had a time sensitive tip. And so they threw one of their, two incredibly high powered attorneys at this thing, and we were able to move through it quickly and make some very small changes and then get it out.
The pre-publication review of an article, you're going to have 2 cultures in tension, right? The reporting culture, which is like, we got to get this out because it's the story might get stale or lost or blown. And the lawyer culture, which is like, we're going to need some time to make sure this is safe. So any of you, how do you balance that tension of the 2 cultures?
I can say that is a very astute observation that actually, in the context of these folks, breaks down pretty quickly. I had the same assumptions. But these are newsroom lawyers, and even when it's folks who are working pro bono, who are not based at DWT, for example, the Microsoft folks, I mean, they're very quickly enculturated into, and often have either backgrounds in or certainly appreciation for journalism, and so one would think that would be more of an issue. If anything, it's a collaboration, and there have certainly been times where we went back on things and took a little longer than maybe we wanted to, rather than the other way around.
They can collaborate so quickly because they have an ongoing relationship. And the importance of creating a relationship in advance of a crisis or a deadline was part of the conversation early on in the development of the ProJourn Pro Bono project.
As Jeff described, as Open Vallejo was essentially launching, and that was around the time that ProJourn was still a pilot. We didn't have dedicated staff like Flavie Fuentes yet. We were just a pilot program. One of the things we were doing is we were getting escalations from various journalists. We were trying to get these referrals, right? We were also looking for recurring clients. And that's where Tom said, we might have a good fit here for a recurring client. And that was Open Vallejo. And you went right to something really important, the fast turnaround on pre-publication review and that immediacy that's needed. And the challenge of saying, let's get through pleasantries, let's get through how do we work together. Tom was essentially saying, if we had some people within Microsoft and some people within Davis Wright who regularly work with Jeff and his team, we could be really of value to them because they won't need to get to know like new lawyer here, new lawyer there every time. So what ended up happening was that essentially we had a few matters that came through that were really just striking because of the kind of journalism that Jeff King and his team were doing. And I think we kept saying we want more. And so we had basically 2 buckets: pre-publication review, which as you described was fast turnaround. And then we realized from that context of these stories that Jeff shared with us, do you know how many public records requests? I think there was more than 30 that Jeff, have made, and I haven't gotten complete or any answers. And they've not fully responded. So that was the point in time where Tom said, we need to consider what the next action is.
And so you started down the train of getting information and using open records laws to get information, and got to a point where you had 30 requests that were either incompletely answered or just ignored. And we're doing the pre-publication review with Seema and the team at Microsoft and the team at Davis Wright. And they said, we should start suing. And Sarah, that's where you came in, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, I think I think where this kind of starts, which is a half step backwards, is that the California legislature passed a new law in 2019 called the Right to Know Act. And the Right to Know Act, for the first time, made several categories of police records subject to release under the CPRA that had not been subject to release in many decades in California. Before this, California actually had a really bad kind of secrecy compared to other states for police records. And so the legislature passed SB 1421. That's the statute that Jeff was submitting his public records requests under. That statute made the following categories of records disclosable kind of for the first time. Records where police shot someone, where they killed someone, where they caused a great bodily injury, or where there was an administrative finding that an officer had engaged in either sexual assault on a member of the public or dishonesty. And so Jeff was basically requesting those records. They are obviously precisely the kind of records that police don't want to release because they are kind of the most tense and most, prickly sort of records. And so when it got to us, it was clear that if we did nothing, Open Vallejo was never going to get these records. And anytime you have a situation like that, there is a ticking clock because agencies have what are called retention schedules, which are, periods of time in which they are required to keep records. But retention schedules all end at some point. And so if you don't force the release of the records, they will inevitably at some point be destroyed. So yeah, Jeff came to ProJourn. By the time it got to me, I think it was already Microsoft had already been putting the complaint together. We kind of edited it and got it on file. And then what happened was kind of interesting because, we do a lot of Public Records Act work. Often what'll happen when you file a CPRA complaint is that the agency will sort of immediately do better. It'll be afraid of the prospect of litigation, and so it will start producing the records that it previously had withheld. And that's just not at all what happened here, which was I think kind of what made this lawsuit so ripe, because what happened here was we got on a call with the assistant city attorney and we were like, Jeff has submitted all these requests. We think that there's this very long list of missing records. And we are happy to just have you give us those records and not proceed with the case. That would be our preference. That's what we do in most CPRA cases. So if we can just agree on a timeline when you're going to produce all these things, then we'll be happy and you'll be happy. And the city attorney in response to that said, we think we've produced everything except a few audiovisual records, and that's it. There was no desire from the city's part to be collaborative at the beginning, which I think is why the suit ended up being as big and dramatic as it was. After we filed, we had this big long list from Jeff of things that he thought existed that the city hadn't given us. And many of those things were situations where Jeff was aware that someone had died in police custody that the city was not releasing records related to. And we didn't know why the city hadn't produced those records exactly. I mean, we had suspicions, but the thing about a Public Records Act lawsuit is you always don't know what you don't know. And so we ended up taking discovery because the other sort of piece here was that we thought that even where the city had produced records, they had made incomplete productions. And often what they had failed to produce was kind of the most interesting and most important records. And that would be like video, things kind of the first person unmediated recording of what happened. And so we ended up in a deposition with the city's person most knowledgeable, so the person that the city designated, who was a public servant who had been doing the public records, responses and producing the records.
She was an analyst for the Vallejo Police Department, but she was the, at times, lone person tasked with processing all of these public records. You could sense the fatigue and the frustration really palpably in that room. She said she asked for a team and didn't get one. She was really handling this stuff, I think, as best she could. These requests largely on her own with very little support, and a very bright person, I think an ethical person.
And ultimately ended up in this moment where I offhandedly asked if she was aware of whether any records had been wrongfully destroyed. And that was a routine question that I thought I was asking only to make sure, to check off my list. I never expected a positive response, but she paused and said yes. All the air leave the room because you usually don't get kind of straightforward responses like that. And so then we went on and we asked what the records were, and it turned out that they were records related to 5 controversial police shootings that the city of Vallejo had been involved in.
Let's sit with that one for a moment. Open Vallejo requested records about police shootings. California had passed a law to make sure these kinds of records would be available to the public. The city then asserted they had produced all the records, but Open Vallejo was pretty sure that was not true. Then, in the middle of the lawsuit to enforce the Open Records Law, Vallejo's own records coordinator disclosed that the city had destroyed the requested information about 5 controversial police shootings.
Then at some point I asked, and what was your reaction when you learned that they had been destroyed? And she starts saying something. I thought you were asking what was my physical reaction when I learned. And that hadn't been what I was asking, but she clearly wanted to provide that. And so I paused and said, actually, sure. And then she said, I screamed. And yeah, I mean, it was like the kind of moment that doesn't, depositions tend to be pretty dry. And
Right.
It was not dry.
You can hear the audio of that public records coordinator saying, I screamed, I was enraged, in Open Vallejo's February 5th, 2023 article headlined, Senior Officials Ordered Destruction of Vallejo Police Shooting Evidence.
And so we were, of course, very interested in how those records came to be destroyed. We spent several months trying to convince the city to provide us with discovery about the destruction of those records. And the city pretty much stonewalled us and said no. And so the city had this theory that they could not be penalized for destroying records that were subject to the request while the request was pending. They had a theory that under the CPRA, all they can be ordered to do is to produce withheld records. And so they thought the court had no power to sanction them for destroying records that were subject to our request while the request was pending. We thought that was ridiculous. Obviously, the incentive structure there is very bad. And so we went to court, and ultimately the court did order them to give us a deposition. We took that deposition about the destruction in December of 2022, and it was that itself was kind of a very, very dramatic moment because we showed up at the deposition. It was a different deponent than we had taken the deposition of before. A lot of things came out of that deposition. Among them, we learned that in between the time when the Right to Know Act went into effect, or between when it was passed and when it went into effect, the city changed its retention schedule. So it used to be that the city held on to all records of police shootings indefinitely, which is what they do for other homicide records, which makes sense. But after the Right to Know Act went into effect, or was passed, but before it went into effect, they changed it. And so they only had to hold on to records of police shootings for, I think, 10 years, while all other homicide records still were maintained forever.
I want to make sure this part is very clear. Between the time when California passed a law giving public access to records of police killings and when that law went into effect, Vallejo changed its retention policy for those records from indefinite retention to only 10 years. When they got a records request for that information, they stonewalled the reporter and forced a lawsuit. Knowing full well that Open Vallejo was actively pursuing its rights to access those records, the city of Vallejo then destroyed them. And Sarah wanted to know, who had approved the destruction of records, knowing full well they were the subject of an active legal dispute.
Because I had been asking, like, who approved this? And so the city attorney hands me this email. We're all looking at it. It's silent in the room. The email was that very city attorney approving the destruction of the records. And I think it was just an insane moment because it's like, we've been litigating this. She's been arguing that the court can do nothing about this. There's no remedy here. And then it turns out like the person arguing that is the person who approved it. And so, yeah, so we learned that the sort of second, I think of that as kind of the first wave of the litigation.
That's only the first wave?
Well, I think, yeah, I think there's three, and I think we're working on the third one now. Yeah, I think the sort of second piece that was really critical. So after we had that deposition, we filed a brief that asked the court to find that the destruction of the records violated the California Public Records Act. We also asked the court to order the city to produce certain records where we knew that people had died in police custody that they had not produced to us. And those were records that Jeff and his team had sort of very carefully and very analytically compiled from coroner's reports from in-custody deaths. And so we knew from the coroner's reports that these were people who had been tased by the police and then died within a short period of time afterwards, I think all in the custody of the police. And the city had withheld those records, arguing that there was no great bodily injury there because the death was deemed by the coroner to be an excited delirium death, which is now, I think, a term that coroners no longer think is scientifically proper. But I guess at the time they did. And so the city argued, like, we didn't actually cause any of these deaths, and you haven't been able to show that we caused a great bodily injury before the person died either. And so you're not entitled to these records. But what we did know is that they had been tased. And we had some pretty gnarly details from the coroner's files. For example, one of the people that we thought that they should have released had been, his sister had come to see him in the hospital and had gasped to see his body because it was so bruised and beaten. And so we asked the court to require them to produce those 5 sets of records. And really what we thought was what we wanted and what we asked the court to do is to require them to re-review all of the great bodily injury records because we thought that they had applied an erroneously high standard and that these 5 were sort of just an example of that. So the court functioned a test where he said basically if someone is tased and then dies within a certain period of time, that's a great bodily injury. And so you have to produce those. And so we did end up getting those records. And I mean, those records were kind of truly astonishing because in some of them, we learned that what the police had told the coroner was a lie. And so, for example, there was a case where the police had told the coroner that a young man who I think was 19 had been tased like 3 or 4 times, some sort of minimal kind of tasing, and then died. It turned out that he had been tased basically for 3 minutes and then died. So, I mean, it was atrocious. So those were sort of the first 2 parts. The last part is that after we uncovered the destruction of records, Open Vallejo, after sort of that came out in litigation, Open Vallejo published an incredible story. And because of that story, the Vallejo City Council instituted or started an investigation into the destruction of records. And there's a report from that investigation. So we, of course, asked the city, and from the very beginning, we've been asking the city for that report. City refuses to give it to us. So the last stage here is that we will file a brief asking for that report. Yes, there's a real irony here.
Do they not learn that you are the embodiment of the never mess with a free lawyer?
Right. Yeah,
partnered with a nonprofit journalist. I mean, this sounds exhausting.
Is it exhausting or is it invigorating? I don't.
No, I mean, this is probably my favorite case. Like, this is probably the case that has felt the most meaningful to me because I think, I mean, obviously Jeff is brilliant. And so working with Jeff is a real pleasure. And also he is wildly dogged, sometimes to even
That's
my annoyance, but in a way I appreciate. And so, I mean, there's just like, there is no false end here because we will not allow there to be one. I think we're going to keep doing it until we have everything that we're entitled to.
And keep in mind, the reason we know that many of these records exist are, for example, our entire team going through for months, even prior to the litigation, going through tens of thousands of pages of evidence logs. The records that were destroyed, we already knew about them specifically because the city tried to charge us more than $25,000 to censor them when they still existed. So we have actually a list of those records with prices next to them for us to pay illegally, it turns out, to pay redaction costs that, then they just got rid of.
I highly recommend heading over to openvallejo.org, where you can read the in-depth reporting, both about the struggle to get these records and about the people who died as a result of mistreatment by the police and about their families who are seeking accountability and a measure of closure. There's just a lot of tragedy for a lot of people, a lot of families, and the work that you're doing to bring it to light, to try to get accountability, to potentially change the incentive structure and the behaviors for your community is a huge deal. What are your reflections on the experience of getting all of this really top-notch pro bono legal help?
There's almost an irony or a tension because a lot of what we did initially was done with no resources. Nothing like these folks. I mean, a lot of that initial work was really shoestring, really was just pure stubbornness, caffeine, an internet connection, a laptop. But that only takes you so far. And so I do want to say that there's a quote from Ida B. Wells: the way to right wrongs is to shine the light of truth upon them. And so this, as Sarah said, the city of Vallejo was never going to properly respond to these disclosures. And it would be impossible, both without the brilliance and dedication of the minds and the strength of the hearts of the people who are working on this in a fairly large team now with enormous resources and the compulsory power of the courts. It just would not be happening. It would not have happened. ProJourn has been transformative for us. Most of our work would not be possible without them, however stubborn I may be.
I want to just touch on one thing. As we've grown, we have more and more partners. That includes in-house legal departments as well as law firms. And I think no matter who you talk to who's worked on Open Vallejo, it is the fact that this is so impactful work. Meaning, as any professional, you're looking to find those things that truly matter. And that's where you know that your work is going to have impact. In Jeff's case, what he's doing with Open Vallejo, these are stories that would not otherwise be told. They are of enormous magnitude, and yet his stories have actually had ripple effect. Other journalists have covered because he has shone the light on things. And I think that's anybody who's worked on this stuff has been struck. How could you have today a town with 30 fatal police shootings and not a single prosecution? And I think, especially following George Floyd, where many people might have thought that somehow some outlier, this is the
Right.
everyday life in a town not far from San Francisco. How can this be happening?
Sarah, you talked about this being the dream job that you both earned and then it fell in your lap and you get to do work that is a public good. Can you talk about the impact on you specifically of the work with Open Vallejo?
Yeah. I think this work has done a lot for me. I think professionally, I've had a lot of experiences that I would not have otherwise had for my level. I got to take several depositions when I was like a third or fourth year attorney. I argued our writ petition in court, which was a several hour long argument because in California, the writ petition is basically like a trial. And so I think that there's the skill piece. But I think the other piece for me that has been the most important is just that it's been such a meaningful case to me that it makes my job feel really worth doing. I really deeply believe in transparency, and I really deeply believe in journalism and fairness. And I think, doing this kind of work sustains me because it just feels like I am really contributing something to the world.
I just want to say thank you to PLI for shining a light on my hometown and the work that we're doing, and to thank the amazing people, not just the attorneys, but all of the support staff, the paralegals. We really deeply appreciate you, and I believe that the work that y'all are doing is contributing to a safer and more just society. And so I really want to say thank you.
There is room and support for so many more legal professionals to get involved with ProJourn. You can check out the project and the volunteer opportunities at projourn.org. They need lawyers and paralegals. They need experienced attorneys and junior attorneys and bilingual attorneys. They can support in-house counsel and private firm lawyers. They can support you to make sure good journalism that holds powerful people accountable can thrive in this country.
Thanks for listening to Pursuing Justice, the Pro Bono Files, a podcast from PLI, the Practicing Law Institute. This production is dedicated to the pro bono and public interest lawyers working to improve access to justice. A special thanks goes to our producer, Daniel Peinitz, as well as our host, Alicia Aiken. Please note that the views and opinions expressed during this podcast represent those of the individuals being interviewed and not necessarily those of PLI. PLI is a nonprofit learning organization dedicated to keeping attorneys and other professionals at the forefront of knowledge and expertise. For more information about PLI's wide-ranging curriculum of pro bono programs, visit pli.edu/pro bono.